Okay, so welcome back to lecture. This is 7.7. We're on slide 71 of the Human Genetic Disorders presentation. So for this objectives or overview, what we'll be talking about today in lecture, you'll be able to describe the major types of genetic diseases as well as being able to give an example of each type. You'll learn about dominant and recessive diseases, as well as genetic conditions that are X-linked because of chromosomal abnormalities. You will also begin your genetic disorder research project and hopefully choose a genetic condition to learn more about. So let's get right into it with what are human genetic disorders. So these genetic disorders are coming from mutations in human DNA. Recall that a mutation can be caused by a single mistake in the DNA replication process or during meiosis in that process as well. And so when there is a mutation in a person's DNA, these can be inherited from parents to offspring. And some genetic conditions are going to result from a single gene mutation, while others involve multiple genes and environmental factors. When we look at a missing or an extra chromosome, that might cause a more severe mutation than a addition or substitution that we looked at from DNA mutations back in Unit 6. So for genetic disorders, again, they have this inheritance pattern where they're passed from parents to offspring. And if that parent has the genetic disorder or is a carrier of that disorder, then the offspring could be affected. When we look at mutations that are present in the DNA of an egg or sperm cell, and those being passed to offspring, we know that mutations that occur in a parent's body cell are not the ones that are passed to offspring. Single gene mutation disorders, single gene mutation genetic disorders are caused by a mutation to one gene. There are over 4,000 identified single gene mutation disorders. So there's lots and lots of different things that could happen, and it's going to depend on what does happen. So sometimes an individual only needs to have one copy of a mutated gene in order to be affected by the disease. And that would be if the disease is dominant. So we'll look at the pattern of inheritance with that, because something that would be a dominant disease, you'd only need one copy in order to be affected. Other times you have to have two copies of that affected gene in order to actually have the disease be expressed. And so if that disease is recessive, that would be how that pattern would fall. And so if you are carrying a copy of a recessive disease, then again, you could be called a carrier because you'd only have one copy of that mutated disease or mutated gene, but you wouldn't be affected by the genetic disorder. However, you could still pass along that to offspring just based on the Punnett square and how that would be inherited. So again, there's 3 different types of single gene mutation disorders that we could kind of put these under. So as to how genetic disorders are inherited, they're going to follow a specific pattern of inheritance based on how the affected gene is passed from parent to offspring. And these could either be autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, or X-linked. When we talk about autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive, we should be thinking about our autosomes, which are the chromosomes 1 through 22. For autosomal dominant disorders, a person is only going to need one mutated copy of a gene in order to be affected by the autosomal dominant genetic disorder. For example, Huntington's disease would follow this pattern of inheritance, where the disease is dominant and the healthy gene would be recessive. So even if you only have one affected copy, you would still have the disease. As for autosomal recessive, you would need to have 2 mutated copies of the gene in order to be affected by an autosomal recessive genetic disorder. For example, cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia, you'd have to have 2 copies of recessive mutated genes in order to express the disease. And then for X-linked genetic disorders, these are caused by mutations that fall on the X chromosome. And so because these disorders are usually recessive, and females have 2 copies of the X chromosome, females would be 46-XX. If one of those has a mutated copy of a gene, but it's a recessive disorder, then it's going to affect females less often, right? And so in contrast, males who are genotype 46-XY, they only have one copy of the X chromosome. So if that one copy that they have is has a mutation on it, then they would express the gene for whatever disease that would be. So some genetic diseases are more common in males, and these usually would be X-linked genetic disorders that are recessive. And so, for example, hemophilia, which is a clotting disorder where it's hard for your blood to form clots, and color blindness also is more common in males. As we get into more detail on autosomal recessive and dominant, let's look again at what an autosome is. It's a non-sex chromosome, so chromosomes 1 through 22. So looking at that karyotype, you'd see the first 22 would be autosomes. So if there is a mutation to any of the chromosomes 1 through 22, then that would be an autosomal disorder. So for an autosomal dominant, again, this person only needs to have one mutated copy of a gene in order to be affected by this autosomal dominant genetic disorder. So in the autosomal dominant inheritance pattern, the disorder is dominant and the healthy allele is recessive. Both Huntington's disease and Marfan syndrome are two examples of autosomal dominant disorders. When we look at this Punnett square, and our capital H is for the diseased gene, and the lowercase h is for the healthy disorder or gene. The healthy gene. If the genotype of parent 1 would be heterozygous, they actually have the disorder, and the other parent 2, would be homozygous recessive, so they would be fully healthy. So if these two parents had offspring, there would be a 50-50 chance that their child would be affected by the disease. Here's kind of a diagram of how that would play out if the father is the one that's carrying the affected abnormal gene, and the mother had, again, the homozygous recessive for the normal gene. This would be what potentially could be of their offspring, with 50-50 affected and 50-50 not affected. As for autosomal recessive, this works really similarly, just in the opposite way, that the healthy gene would be dominant and the diseased gene would be recessive. And so a carrier could be a person that has a copy of this genetic disorder, but it's not expressed because they don't have two copies, right? And so if there is one copy normal and one copy abnormal, then for each parent, right, so that would be heterozygous. Looking at for cystic fibrosis, which is a autosomal recessive pattern of inheritance genetic condition, if two parents who were carriers had offspring, there would be a 25% chance of having an affected child who has two abnormal copies of the gene. So to inherit an autosomal recessive disorder, both parents have to be carriers of the disorder. So looking at, again, how that would play out in real life, here is a diagram of both parents being heterozygous for the abnormality, and then what their offspring could potentially be like, with 25% chance that the child would be affected by this disorder. As for an X-linked pattern of inheritance, again, these are going to be recessive. On this, the mutated gene is located on the X chromosome. So because male carriers of an X-linked disorder are going to pass the unaffected Y to their sons, the kid would not be affected. But if he had a daughter, then he would pass an X chromosome with that abnormal gene to the daughter, and they would be a carrier of the disease as well. And then potentially that child that is now a carrier of the X-linked recessive could potentially pass along the X-linked affected or X-linked disorder to her offspring. As for female carriers of an X-linked recessive disorder, what that would look like oftentimes because these are recessive and we have 2 copies of the X chromosome, it would be a low likelihood the person would be affected. However, if the mom passed along the X chromosome to her son, then the son would be affected by this X-linked recessive disorder because they only have 1 X chromosome. So here's an example of how that would play out. Again, the first scenario is it's the father that is carrying this affected X chromosome, and then their offspring would be carriers. As for the second scenario, if the carrier is along the mother's genes, she would pass along the abnormal gene to a male offspring and he would be affected, or she could pass along another carrier gene. Not all genetic diseases are so easily mapped to coming from one specific thing. When you look at polygenic genetic disorders, this occurs because some disorders are not caused by a mutation in a single gene. Instead, they result from the combined effect of multiple genes and environmental factors. So we call these polygenic or multifactorial disorders. Good common examples to know for this would be like heart disease, diabetes, schizophrenia, certain cancers. They would be, they say like, oh, it runs in your family, but there is no like clear-cut pattern of inheritance. Asthma is also high on this list. They're difficult to study because oftentimes they are associated with lifestyle and environmental factors. We can't exactly narrow down where on the genes that came from. So to wrap all that up, human genetic disorders can be inherited in several different ways. They can be autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, or X-linked. X-linked recessive disorders are more likely to affect males because of their single X chromosome. Some disorders are polygenic, meaning that they involve multiple genes and environmental factors.